Um, so we are live after Captain Swiss's week and a half hiatus, and there's not an awful lot going on apart from some very interesting leaked messages to do with US security. And I think also we probably want to talk about the Labour welfare reforms. I'm here with Tom. Hello there, Tom.
Hello.
Um, so we've just literally jumped into it today. So I suppose the first thing I'll ask you then, what would you prefer to talk about first? Would you like to talk about this group chat that the journalist was involved in the US, or do you want to talk about labour and welfare?
I'll probably go for labour and welfare first because there's not too much I have to say on welfare, whereas there is a lot that I have to say about the US messages.
Okay, all right, then we'll do that one first. So I think it was probably the last time I streamed. I forget who it was in the chat. Oh shit, Frank's saying I sound like a Dalek. Do I sound like a Dalek to you?
You do a bit, which is why I didn't say anything because it's quite funny.
Any better now?
Yes, it's much better now.
All right. I'm just gonna freeze and try not to move because apparently my instruments are very sensitive today. Yeah, when I did a stream a little while ago, I think someone in the chat had said to me, "Oh, what do you think about the benefit reforms?" And at the time, then all I'd heard was just sort of like, you're trailing an announcement, your rumours. So I didn't really comment on it then. But then prior to Rachel, no, was it Rachel Reeves or was it Liz Kendall? I forget which. But prior
Was
to
Liz Kendall.
Liz Kendall. Prior to her giving a speech in the Commons, I think I'd heard that one of the things they were considering was a freeze to PIP. And then because of pushback from Labour MPs who were discussing it with them, they decided to can that one. Now, I think since they've said, oh, no, we were never considering putting a freeze on PIP, but I think they were. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't have heard about it. What about the rest of this? Because I'm very conflicted on how I feel about this, Tom. On the one hand, I'm looking at some graphs in front of me, and it says about what the projected benefits bill is going to be, especially I think for disability benefit. And it says over the course of the next 4 or 5 years, it's set to increase from like 75 billion a year to 100 billion a year, something in that kind of a range. And you go, oh, crikey, okay, that is quite a lot then. And they say that there are probably more people claiming it than ought to be claiming it, which again, reasonable enough that you want to do something about that. However, my concern, obviously, with it first and foremost, is that measures they want to take to try and get people who are able to work into work, absolutely fair dues. But as far as tightening the criteria of who is able to claim some of these benefits or indeed disability benefit, my primary concern there is are people who actually ought to be eligible for this going to end up falling foul of these new requirements, and therefore Labour's effectively going to be dunking on the poor and vulnerable, which was an easier sell when it was the foreign aid budget, because that's poor and vulnerable people in other countries that you don't have to look at. This is poor and vulnerable people in this country. Probably going to get a bit more of a pushback. What are your thoughts on what you've heard so far about all that?
I mean, as I said, I'm more or less in the same ballpark as you, really. The only thing I would really add to it is I just find this whole thing just to be basically an example of deja vu, really, because this is not the first time the government has made, well, the British government as a whole has made these type of reforms in an attempt in order to get a better outcome from the welfare bill. But the problem is that every time they've tried to get a better deal per se from this, it's never worked. It's either made the problem worse or just not solved it. Like when we had this happen under Osborne, welfare bills still kept going up, but you just had loads of stories of people being put in really precarious situations that they ought to have not been in the first place. So I just get a feeling of deja vu when I look at this, where basically I don't see why the same thing isn't going to happen again as what happened during the days of George Osborne. That plus the fact that the government themselves openly admit that this isn't really going to reduce the welfare bill in the long term. It will simply slow down the rise.
Slow,
Because
yeah. Go on.
the,
Sorry.
the reason for that is because the underlining reasons as to why the welfare bill is rising in the first place simply haven't been addressed at all by the government. And those are things like poor wages, which we've had for about 20 years at this stage. Um,
Are you there, Tom?
oh,
Okay,
sorry about that.
there we
I was
go.
going to say poor wages, poor health outcomes, both mental and physical, and our population not really having recovered from COVID and the after effects of COVID, because I was reading a report from the Institute of Fiscal Studies which showed that things like so-called deaths of despair have gone up and are still above what they were pre-pandemic level. And deaths of despair is basically things like related to food overconsumption or underconsumption. So things like heart disease and heart attacks, etc. Rates of smoking have gone up, rates of alcoholism have gone up. So the reasons as to why the welfare bill are rising is not being addressed here. And so I just simply don't think this is going to work. And I think this is just an example of history repeating itself from the days of George Osborne.
I think that there's quite a bit to unpack in all of that. And what I'm minded to do is to try to separate out certain different elements of the welfare bill, as we call it, because obviously there's all these different kinds of payments depending on what criteria you meet, what the purpose ends up being. So if we talk about disability benefit and personal independence payment specifically, I've got an article here, and I want to try and bring up now. As I understand it, by the way, I don't think all of the nuts and bolts of what they're actually going to be doing to it have been laid out yet. As far as I'm aware, I think they've given us sort of a sense of direction overall, and they've said, "Oh yes, there'll be extra criteria for this and blah blah blah," but we don't know. Well, at least I don't know precisely what it's going to be yet. But I'll read through just a little bit of this, and I know you're burning to get onto America, so we'll do that soon enough as well. The government has unveiled sweeping changes to the benefits system aimed at saving $5 billion a year by 2030. Liz Kendall wanted to create a pro-work system to encourage people to take up jobs while protecting those who cannot work. The changes will make it harder for people with less severe conditions to claim disability payments. Extra benefit payments for health conditions will also be frozen for current claimants and nearly halved for new applicants. Hang on. Extra benefit payments for health conditions will also be frozen for current claimants. And see, this is one of the things that I was trying to consider with all of this. That on the one hand, I was hearing about tightening up the eligibility criteria for some of this stuff, and I was at the very least thinking about that in terms of people who would newly be applying for these benefits. But if it's the case also that people who are currently on existing benefits are going to have some of those benefits cut, that sits quite uncomfortably with me, to be honest. It's one argument to say maybe not everyone who's getting these benefits ought to be getting them, and we should look more closely at that. That in principle is not something that I'm opposed to. Obviously, I'd be concerned to make sure that the right decisions are made there. But the fact that some people already on benefits are going to have them cut, that's not really it's not often that I quote Diane Abbott, and I won't get in a habit of doing it, but I think she said something like it's a very un-Labour thing to do, or it's not what you'd expect of an elected Labour government to be going after. This feels very Tory, doesn't it?
It's it's not the type of thing you would expect an elected Labour government to do, but therein lies your problem. We don't really have an elected Labour government. We have a Tory party wearing Labour's clothing, is what we really have, to be honest, which is kind of why this sort of thing is happening, really.
Cough, cough, reform, cough, cough, the uni party, cough, cough. Let me do a bit more of this then. People aged under 22 could be prevented from claiming universal credit top-up payments for health conditions. The government has not given a precise breakdown of the forecast savings, but the bulk are expected to come from changes to eligibility for disability payments. See, this is the thing. There's absolutely a part of me that acknowledges that out there in the country, there are probably some people who they get out of school or education or whatever it may be at age 18, and maybe then some of them go, I'm depressed, I'm anxious, I can't work, I need to go on benefits. And probably, yeah, some of those people you'd say, actually, in reality, that's not the right course. That's not the right situation for anyone, really. So again, that much I agree with. Okay, yeah, there's absolutely stuff that needs looking at here. But that very much falls on the eligibility side of things. My bigger concern is people already on benefits having them cut, which is more problematic to me. Object of Hate here in the chat says, don't forget to like the stream if you enjoy the content, you 8 current viewers. Well, there we are. Look, if Object said it, you need to. Spending on health and disability-related benefits has ballooned since the COVID pandemic and has been forecast to increase from 65 billion a year currently to 100 billion by 2029. Now, you mentioned the pandemic, Tom, and as far as I understand it, compared with other countries, we seem to be doing worse in terms of our sort of post-pandemic health recovery, if you want to put it in those kind of terms. You were discussing a few different metrics that things are judged on, and I have heard in sort of like here and there, sort of like little podcasts I listen to and stuff. I think it was mentioned maybe a month ago. I was listening to Andrew Marr on the New Statesman or something like that, and he'd said something along those lines that we, as much as COVID is absolutely an element of the fallout for that is continuing, it does seem like we are having a worse time of it than comparable countries at the moment.
Well, this is largely because we have worse health outcomes compared to comparable countries. Our life expectancy pre-pandemic has still not recovered. People are living longer, shorter lives than they were pre-pandemic. And that's not something that's been entirely new. The UK, in regards to health metrics, has always scored very poorly relative to other developed countries. So it's just a continuation of that, really, but it's just been made worse.
Do you think part of this factor may be, obviously, we've got these great waiting lists and backlogs within the NHS, and arguably a knock-on effect of people not having those health issues addressed is that they're more likely to develop or worsen conditions that would require disability benefits?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Oh, absolutely. If anything, I think that's one of the main reasons why this has happened. But I would say that it's a particular type of thing that's causing it to happen, and that is mental health care. Mental health care access has never been particularly good in this country, but post-COVID, for all intents and purposes, it's as if mental health care just doesn't exist anymore for people. It's incredibly difficult to get any kind of mental health care. And if you are lucky enough to get it, it typically takes months before you're seen by anybody. So you're just going months on end without having your condition addressed. And that naturally, unsurprisingly, gets worse.
I mean, I've in my adult life, I've had issues with mental health over the years. Generally speaking, doing pretty well these days. But I can absolutely empathise with people who've had issues of anxiety and depression, and also I can place myself in the shoes of people who have had experiences worse than my own. Because as much as I've had difficulties over the years, I don't think it's ever quite got to a point where I've been unable to do day-to-day life. Although sometimes it's tricky, but I can absolutely go, yes, I can, I know what it's been like for me when I've been at my worst. So God knows what it's like for people who it's been even worse than that. I've been on and off antidepressants for the past 10 years or so. There was a point I was going to make there. I wasn't just trying to relate this to me, Tom. There was something I was then going to add on and say, and I've forgotten what it was. I think my point I was trying to make there though was that as I say, I can empathise with. Oh yes, that was it. No, you're absolutely right. As far as mental health services in this country go, anecdotally, well, from my own experience as well, but also anecdotally, other people I've spoken to, quite often when it comes to these waiting lists for getting assistance, the only way to really jump the queue, so to speak, and be seen quite quick is to basically say that you want to kill yourself. That is the unfortunate situation we're in, that unless you declare I want to kill myself, you're probably going to get stuck waiting for quite a while.
It's a similar problem with physical health as well, where essentially you have to pretend that you're in an extremely dire situation, such as you're having a heart attack or you're having a stroke, in order to get somebody to see you, basically. And it's just a further indictment of how terrible the healthcare system has developed in this country, where in order to get the most basic of basic healthcare, you have to like pretend that you're in a worse position than you are, even though you shouldn't do that and shouldn't have to do that. But but again, this is the sort of problem. We are creating these perverse incentives in so many different aspects of public life that it's leading to these sort of outcomes.
I'll read a little bit more of this article that we have here on this as well. Kendall said eligibility for PIPs, the main disability benefit in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, would be tightened from November 2026. It will become harder to qualify for the daily living component of PIP, which is for people who need help with everyday tasks and starts at £72 a week. There will be no change to the mobility components for those who need help getting around. Kendall told it is more arguably it is going to be more of a focus on criteria for mental health related things rather than physical health related things, from what I'm reading here at least. The resolution
from what I've read as well, from what I've read about it, the people that seem to be targeted the most by this are people who have mental health conditions and people who suffer from temporary disability related to pain causing disability, so like muscular pain and symptoms like that. From what I've seen, or from what Labour claims anyway, whether this actually happens in practice or not is anybody's guess. People who have developmental disabilities like I think autism was cited as one example, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, those were mentioned a few times. They are not being impacted by this as far as I'm aware, but again, it remains to be seen, because what they say and what they do is always two completely different things a lot of the time. Physical disability, that's not being impacted either. People who basically are severely inhibited by whatever disability they have, to the point where doing basic physical activity is too difficult for them. They're not being impacted, or at least, again, so they claim. But the primary focus seems to be on mental health conditions and disabilities that are temporary related to pain.
I mean, I think I'm repeating myself at this point, which is to say that I completely acknowledge that there are probably some people out there claiming some of these benefits who, in fact, probably don't actually need them. Reasonable enough. However, as I keep coming back to, my real concern is that people who ought to be on them and who are on them are going to potentially see the money that they're getting cut as a result of this change in eligibility. It's a bit like you remember when they made the changes to the winter fuel payments, but there wasn't the sort of a means testing or anything. It was just kind of, right, if you're on benefits, you get the winter fuel payments. If you're not on benefits, you don't. Done. And that kind of really missed that sort of finer line of people who were, just about earning enough money not to be on any form of benefits, but then with the reduction of the winter fuel payments, probably then that pushed them into needing to claim some other benefit. It wasn't a surgical policy. It wasn't sort of. I don't think it was really looked at it was just a sort of a fairly arbitrary cutoff point. I mean, what it says here, the Resolution Foundation think tank has estimated that between 800,000 and 1.2 million people could lose supports because of restrictions on claiming PIP. Now, of course, this is just an estimate by a think tank, but nonetheless, if their estimate is to say, okay, maybe about 1 million or so people could end up losing support as a result of these changes. As much as I've been willing to say, yeah, there probably are some people gaming the system, I don't think it's 1 million people. I don't think it's anywhere near 1 million people. This is my concern, really. That there's that sort of conservative feeling line of kind of going, oh, all these, all these bloody snowflakes, oh, they're anxious and they're depressed and they need to pull their socks up, and our great grandparents were fighting in the war and they won't go outside and blah blah blah. I don't like that. I don't like that kind
it's
of
just the
bravado
sort of
on this,
It's the sort of Daily Mail tripe that we were reading in the early 2010s, where it's like, oh, the scroungers and the layabouts claiming 70 grand a week in benefits. It's like that complete and utter nonsense stuff.
Yeah, and exactly, and it's like you can identify a problem and to say, okay, there probably are, as I say, some people who shouldn't be on it, but then in the way that you choose to address it, you may in fact end up fucking over quite a few people who actually, by every metric, ought to be getting these sorts of benefits. I want to read a little bit more of this. Oh, so this is the projection, by the way. Health and disability benefit spending is expected to rise. And this is forecast, obviously, but it says from where they are at the moment on about 65 billion, they expect that by the end of the decade it will be about 100 billion. And I think this is a year. I'm assuming it's a year. So that's I mean, crikey, that's an increase of getting on for about 50% or so from where we are at present, assuming the estimate is correct in 5 years' time. I can understand the need to look at that and say, okay, yeah, there is a problem there. That does seem like a very big increase. Now, like you were saying about the root causes of this kind of thing. Actually, no. Well, I'm thinking about the NHS backlog and stuff, but I think that probably more pertains to sort of operations and stuff rather than sort of the mental health stuff that this is looking at. But then again, we've already acknowledged that there are big old waiting lists when it comes to mental health care as well. I don't know. I don't want to keep going over the same talking points here, but I could understand acknowledging some problems that there are, but I am concerned that they're probably going to go too far in some areas and end up hurting people that really aren't in a situation where they need more money being taken off of them right now. From April next year, go on,
read through it.
Oh, okay. From April next year, the extra amount of universal credit for a health condition or disability will be frozen for existing claimants until 29/30 and cut by almost half for new claimants. Crikey. There will be an additional premium for people with severe lifelong conditions that mean they will never work. Okay, right. So people with very serious conditions that cannot work at all, no dispute, no debate, no chance of being able to change it, that will go up for them. Meanwhile, there will be a permanent above inflation rise to the standard allowance of universal credit, equivalent to 775 annual increase in cash terms by 29/30. So actually, if the basic allowance of universal credit is going up, then arguably that will make up somewhat some of the shortfall. Because I'm assuming if you're on PIP, say, you are probably also on universal credit. That's my assumption I'm making here. So if one of them's going down and the other one's going up, that's good. But the fact that all these measures are being taken in order to save money, obviously it says to me that it's not, it's not going to perfectly equal itself out one way or another. You're still going to end up with a net of a large number of people either not qualifying for these benefits or not getting as much money as they were before, all in all. Um, what would you go? I'll say this and I'll chuck it over to you. Obviously, you know, we're waiting to see exactly what the nuts and bolts of this end up being, what the new eligibility criteria ends up being, and unfortunately, really, I think that we can only really tell whether this policy is going too far and not well targeted enough once the effects of it start coming in.
From what
But
I've
go
seen,
on. What did you want to say on it?
I mean, to be fair, they have already released a bunch of details about it in days since this article was published.
Okay. Fair play.
I mean, we can't really go into them because we've got to move on to the US thing because it'll take too long. But basically, the overall opinion I have on it is the same, regardless of the details of it. Is that I understand why they're doing this, because it is true that the situation with welfare in this country is not sustainable in the long term for many, many different reasons. We have terrible economic growth, so and our borrowing costs are simply too high due to interest rates being the way that they are at the moment. So this isn't something we can continue to afford to keep doing in the long term, especially since there really just doesn't seem to be an end to this in terms of welfare keeping going up as the years go on. So I understand why they've done this. My issue is, however, is basically past history. If it wasn't for what happened during the and under George
Oh, Tom, sorry. Your mic's gone a bit muffled there.
Oh, okay. Is it better now?
Yeah.
Right. So basically, if it wasn't for the coalition days and the era of George Osborne, where this had been done in the past, if this was a completely novel thing, then I would lean towards the position of, okay, I get people's concerns, but we should at least try something new so we can see what happens. But the problem is we've done this before. We did it with George Osborne in the 2010-2015 period, and all that ended up happening is we made a whole bunch of people who were disabled, who deserved to be on welfare, but weren't because of his punitive measures, and poverty increased amongst those people, and we had an increase in excess deaths due to a variety of different reasons, and it didn't even decrease the welfare bill. It went up again, regardless, as evidenced by this being an issue. His reforms were a failure, objectively speaking, and I get the feeling, as I said at the start of all this, that this is just deja vu, that we're seeing history repeat itself, where we're just going to get the same outcome that we did about 10 years ago, with no change to the overall problem. And the other thing as well is I don't think that the type of benefit that they've targeted is really the one that they should be targeting. In my honest opinion, I think the benefit that needs to be targeted the most for cuts is housing benefit, because going back to what I said about perverse incentives, housing benefit is one of the most perverse incentives that there is, because landlords don't have any incentive to cut rent because they know that if their claimant is on housing benefit, they're just going to get money from essentially free money from the government by doing nothing. So, why has housing benefit just not been focused on at all in this regard, even though it's the worst benefit that there is? Because of the perverse incentives that it creates, especially when Labour's whole thing in the campaign and since being in government is all about housing because of the 1.5 million homes pledge. So, and the other thing as well is also motability as well. Now, in fairness to Labour, today, as in this very day, they've already announced changes they're going to make to the motability scheme. So fair enough, but up until today, I honestly wondered why Motability wasn't being targeted, because Motability is just really bad. You're getting a situation where people are essentially being given free cars, even though they don't deserve it, to be honest.
Oh, I see. Well, I've got to admit, probably on both the housing and the Motability, you're speaking on areas that I don't have a great degree of knowledge on. So I'm neither agreeing or disagreeing with you on those. Um, can we zoom out for just a moment here? Because we've been talking about the benefits, but more broadly, we're right on the cusp of the spring statement here. And obviously, the so-called fiscal headroom that Rachel Reeves had for herself in the autumn appears, by all intents and purposes, to have disappeared. And now we're faced with that age-old problem of what do you do? Do you increase taxes? Do you cut spending? Do you borrow some more? Do you grow the economy? I mean, well, we'll all grow the economy if we're able to. And I want to come back to a really, really obvious point, but I do see it being made quite a lot out there, indeed, by proponents on our own wing of politics as well. Could we not tax the rich just a little bit more? Just a wee bit. I know it's unspeakable because they'll all flee overseas the second you do it. But I'm not talking about anything extortionate here. I'm talking about. I mean, what's the current the top rate of tax at the moment? Is it 45%, and is that on earners of 150k a year or more? Is that
Yeah,
right?
it's about that.
Yeah.
It's about that, as far as I'm aware. I mean,
well, let me just very quickly say then, and yeah, this is fairly minuscule, but say you introduce a higher rate of because the thing is, people on the highest rate of tax, they'll say, well, look, hang on a minute, the top rate of tax already, if I'm on 150k or what have you, like that, a person earning that much is wealthy. There's no doubt about it that they're wealthy, but they're not necessarily rich in the sense of when we think about the millionaires and the billionaires out there. What if you introduce a threshold even higher than that, a threshold of if you're earning 250k a year or 500k a year, and you bump that up to 50% or something like that, then you're more specifically targeting the very, very richest in society, and arguably you won't get as much pushback from the sort of the slightly more well-to-do middle classes there, because you really are targeting the richest. Or the other alternative that I've heard people talking about is a wealth tax as opposed to income taxes. Do any of those ideas hold water with you?
this is a complicated situation, to be honest, because from an objective point of view, somebody from my politics would be like, yeah, of course, tax the rich. But for the UK context specifically, this is much more easier said than done. Because for a start, high taxes don't drive people away as much as they think they do, but what often does drive people away is high taxes coupled with a terrible economy. People who live in countries who are rich but have decent economies with high taxes are basically take the attitude of, okay, I'm not happy with the taxes, but I'm willing to absorb the cost of them because I live in a society that has a strong economy. And if I'm a business owner, I'm benefiting overall from the strong economy. So I don't really care that much about the taxes. If you have a situation where you have high taxes, but your economy sucks, then that leads to an exodus of wealthy people because they basically go, okay, I'm being taxed up to my eyeballs and I'm getting absolutely nothing for it. And the economy that I live in is getting worse and worse year on year. Why should I bother continue to staying here when I'm not benefiting from this in any way, shape, or form? And the UK, unfortunately, is one of those examples of a country that, under this scenario anyway, would be heading to high taxes, but also have a terrible economy going along with it. And the effects of this have kind of already been seen. There was a chart that I saw which showed the number of millionaires and billionaires who are leaving certain countries, and the UK was ranked as the second highest country in the world of billionaires and millionaires who are leaving it. China was first, and then we were second. And I wasn't surprised by that at all because the unfortunate reality is that for a lot of people who, whether you're rich or poor, you're paying relatively high taxes for terrible public services and a terrible economy. Essentially, for people in this country, whether they're rich or poor, but especially if they're rich, you're paying in a lot of money for a worse service. And a lot of people are coming to the conclusion of, well, why should I continue to stay here if I'm just getting nothing for this, if I'm getting a terrible deal out of it? And I think that with the current state of the UK economy at the moment, if we were to increase taxes on the rich, I think we would lose more than we would gain, simply because there are so many better alternatives economically out there compared to us that the rich can benefit from simply by leaving here. They can go to the US or the UAE or Singapore or places like that where they pay taxes. Some of it's higher, some of it's lower, but they get more for their money. Whereas if they stay here, they're just not getting their money's worth in taxes. As for the wealth tax specifically, I don't think this. I think this is even worse than doing something like increasing income tax, because whenever wealth taxes have been implemented, they've almost always failed. A clear example of a wealth tax failing, in my opinion, was the French that was implemented.
Oh, I've lost you there again.
Okay. A clear example of a wealth tax that failed, in my opinion. Was
No, I'm sorry, Tom. Are you able to move the microphone at all?
Hello.
Oh, yep, you're back. You're back.
Right, is that any better?
Yep.
Okay, and as I was saying, the French wealth tax that was implemented was a complete failure. It's the clearest example of a failure of a wealth tax that I can think of, because from a period of 2000 to 2012, France lost 42,000 millionaires who went to other European countries and to the United States, amongst other problems. As a result of that, Macron in 2018 axed the wealth tax because it was simply being much more detrimental to the French economy than it was benefiting from it. And
shit. I was going to say shit, because what you've given me there is a real world example of that having an adverse effect. And
the other thing I just want to quickly say as well is another example of, and also an example of wealth tax failing is in 1990, there were 12 European countries that had a wealth tax. And by 2019, only 3 countries in Europe still have a wealth tax, those being Norway, Spain, and Switzerland. So the problem is here, as you can see from empirical examples, wealth taxes don't really work at what they intend to do. So combined with the UK economy being terrible, I think if you implemented a wealth tax in this country, you would basically get the French problem, but on steroids. You would just get a mass exodus of wealthy people from here if you were to do it.
I think the problem is, really, you'd need to get some kind of international cooperation to get a bunch of countries all agreeing to do it together. Because then it makes it more difficult for a person to go, oh, right, well, they're taxing me, I'll just go somewhere else, because then you'll face the same thing if you go elsewhere. But obviously that's a little bit pie in the sky. It's hard to get anyone to agree on bloody anything, let alone implementing a wealth tax across all the many countries. No, what I was going to say is
that I know that Joe Biden did succeed in getting a global agreement on corporation tax being set at a certain level, but yeah, it's an incredibly difficult thing to do, because you would have to get global agreement on it. And I mean, look at the way the world is now. The world can't agree on anything. So good luck getting them to agree on taxes, of all things. I think for me, I think the only tax that I can think of that should be done, that should be raised, is I think that at the end of the day, Reeves is basically going to have to face one of two terrible choices. Either she continues to follow everything that was laid out in Labour's manifesto with regards to taxes, but the problem with that is she boxes herself into an even smaller corner year on year, and she has to basically do austerity every single year, which will just tank Labour's electoral chances and make the country a worse place to live, simply because we've seen what one round of austerity has done. The second one will be just as bad. The other option is basically Reeves breaks her manifesto pledges and she increases one of the taxes that she said she wouldn't, that being income tax, national insurance, or VAT. Or she could reverse Rishi Sunak's national insurance tax cuts that he put in place. And the other thing that could also be done as well, although I don't know how successful it would be because it's never been tried before, is a land value tax, where basically tax is placed upon the value of certain estates and lands.
Can I just quickly jump in there and say, could one of the workarounds for her and say income tax, for example, be just to I was going to say to implement a freeze at the rates, and then obviously inflation ends up dragging people into paying more. But are we not already under a freeze right now? Am I right in that?
Yes,
Well, did the Tories brought in a freeze, and that's due to run for a few more years yet? Still,
Yeah, they brought in a freeze on income tax, which has basically created the situation where you have massive fiscal drag that is really hurting a lot of people and doing a lot of damage to the economy. Because what you're having is you're having people who deliberately choose to not get a pay rise because if they do, even if it's a small pay rise, they immediately fall into a much higher income tax bracket and they end up losing more money than if they had taken the pay cut, essentially. So that's doing a lot of damage to the economy because it's people who have less disposable income to spend to generate economic growth because they don't want to move into a higher tax bracket that will take more money from them than if they took that pay cut. Fiscal drag is a real problem that needs to be solved, and yet Labour just refuses to do it for some reason.
so extending the freeze on the thresholds doesn't sound like the solution to this. Then, I'll say quickly as well. In the chat, a couple of people have said that the apparently it's 125,000 rather than 150,000, as I'd said, on the threshold at which you're taxed 45%.
Yes.
Okay, then. So, given that I think it's unlikely we are going to solve Britain's economic woes within this particular live stream, I think we will move on for the time being. Obviously, we are right on the cusp of the spring statement. Is it tomorrow or Thursday?
It's tomorrow.
It's tomorrow, isn't it? Okay. Oh shoot. I might not be able to stream on that tomorrow evening. It might have to be later in the week that we end up looking at that here on the channel. Okay, but obviously we'll end up seeing what comes out the spring statement, and then we'll have a bit more to pour over there. Tom, what's going on in the US of A right now?
I mean, at this stage, it's probably better to ask what isn't going on over there. Like the whole country just seems to be getting more and more crazy as time goes on.
Now, when I say what's going on in the US of A, I'm not talking about the Department of Education being abolished, and I'm not talking about laws from 250 years ago being brought in to deport people. And I'm not talking about the very strange negotiations going on between the United States and Russia over the fate of Ukraine either. In this particular instance, I'm talking about a journalist who was added to a group chat prior to US military operations, which is a massive, massive breach of security over there, which just, in this country here and there, I think it was, I want to say Priti Patel for some reason. Did Priti Patel get in trouble at some point for using a personal email for something or something along these lines? Something about that's ringing a bell, and it was against national security maybe. And then I think within the past year, I think you had some Labour MPs or councillors getting in trouble because of a group chat that they were in, Trigger Me Timbers, where they were being disparaging about some of their constituents. But this is a slightly different order of things, really. That this is a group of the highest, some of the highest up officials in the United States, people in charge of defence, the vice president, etc. And then some journalist from the Atlantic has just randomly added to their chat while they're planning bombing the Houthis. It's unbelievable. I mean, I think that you, generally speaking, have a better read on these kinds of things than I do. How much of a fuck up is this?
Immense, to put it bluntly. It's the type of thing that, to put it simply, should just literally never happen. Um, if it happens, it's basically just an example. It's just something that should not happen. That's the thing about it. It just simply should not happen. Um, you should not have a situation where some random person gets added into a group chat that discusses military operations. Um, as I say, it is just something that simply does not happen, and yet it has done. And I, I honestly
And
just.
and within that, though, it's worth saying that within that, there were some quite disparaging marks made about Europe within this chat as well. We were accused of freeloading once again and being pathetic. And generally, this is that the United States are the ones who are. Let me think. It's the war in Yemen, isn't it? It's the war in Yemen,
Yeah.
and they're attacking the Houthis. And I think what their concern is that the spillover from that war, or who ends up controlling Yemen, will have a knock-on effect on the canal, the Suez Canal.
Suez Canal, yeah.
Yes, and what they are saying is that obviously a much greater proportion of European trade goes through the Suez, and actually quite a fractional amount of US trade goes through the Suez. So they're saying, well, why are we getting involved in this on behalf of the Europeans? It seems to once again sort of continue on this kind of a line of America going, why the fuck do we give a, why do we give a shit about the European continent, really? Why we, but it's, this is what they say. It's amazing hearing what that some of them are actually saying in private to each other about us now, though. It's not just, JD Vance goes over and gives a speech in Munich about you don't need to worry about Putin because you're all woke. It's why are we even helping them? Why do we care about their economic interests?
I think it's not a surprise to me because it's been abundantly clear that Vance and the US government are very much the patriots, which basically just means that they're like super pro Russia, super pro Putin, super anti Ukraine, super anti NATO, and super anti Europe. I mean, I'm just not particularly surprised by it anymore. So, I mean, when I heard about it, I was like, yeah, that's to be expected because the MAGA cult has essentially developed this idea that Europe is a civilizational enemy to America, and in particular, American conservatism and the right wing ideology that MAGA believes in. Whereas Russia is seen as the based trad con paradise, standing up for Christian family values against the so called degenerate West, is how the MAGA movement sees it. So, what they want is to essentially they want to align the US politically and geopolitically with Russia in order to defeat woke Europe and to restore Europe back to the way it once was, which they see as the correct way. That's essentially the mindset of the US administration at the moment. And the European government seemed completely in denial about this. That at this stage, not Europe, the US is as much of a threat to Europe as basically Iran is at this stage. And yet there's a complete and utter denial about this from European capitals and this belief that somehow, well, we can just be aligned with the US somehow and be on friendly terms with them. Well, you can't.
I agree with the vast.
And the one thing I
majority.
also want to say about the freeloader thing is that the whole reason the Houthis are doing what they're doing in the Red Sea is because of Israel. They're not doing it because of Europe. This is all happening because of Israel's actions in the Gaza Strip.
Can I just say quickly, Tom, we did have some comments in the chat to that effect as well, so I just want to read those out. Shockwave had said the Houthis were only targeting American ships, so Vance was working under a false assumption calling Europe freeloaders. Object says American and Israeli ones, plus hired to do the job by American or Israeli shipping companies, just to add to your point there.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like bashing Europe for this is just completely and utterly ludicrous. when when what the Houthis are doing has absolutely nothing to do with Europe whatsoever. It's entirely based on Israel and America's actions, which is why this has all happened. So what I mean, but that just doesn't matter with this lot. They blame Europe for everything because again, it goes back to what I said that they see Europe as an ideological and even civilizational enemy at this stage that needs to be combated and confronted wherever possible.
I will see. I'm still trying to figure out my thoughts on where exactly I place the Americans in relation to, say, Russia and in relation to Europe and the rest of it. I've been having this internal debate whether or not unreliable ally or an opponent or adversary of sorts, or indeed a full-on enemy. I agreed with the vast majority of what you said a little while ago. That the one thing that perhaps not quite so sure on is when you sort of said that they something along the lines of like they're a bigger threat to us than Iran right now, or something like that. I think that
Not bigger than Iran, but
go on.
on the same level, essentially,
Right,
where
right.
Iran is opposed to European interests as well, and America is as well. And
Yeah. That much I agree with you. In terms of saying, okay, we've got our, obviously everyone's got their own interests, but by and large, for a good old while, it's been broadly seen that American interests, European interests, more aligned than not, to put it one way. And if anything, like this sort of rug pull that you've got going on with the Americans right now, where effectively it kind of seems like NATO's not really necessarily guaranteed, or at least the whole point of NATO in a way is that it serves as a deterrent because everyone believes in it, or at least they're not entirely certain that Article 5 wouldn't be triggered in a certain situation. As soon as doubt starts appearing in that scenario, NATO isn't really worth the paper the documents are written on, because then you go, well, if you don't trust the Americans to be there to back us up, then effectively that's probably the mindset that our enemies or opponents would have as well. So yeah, in that sense, I agree with you. I don't know if I currently place America quite on par with, say, a Russia, who are, proactively trying to fuck us about and have invaded part of our continent and all the rest of it. But I no longer trust the Americans to be helpful. I no longer trust the Americans to act, because I think what you're driving at, and what I think I do agree with, is that the people in charge of the USA right now no longer seem to value or agree with the idea that our prosperity and security is also their prosperity and security. America first, as I've heard paraphrased by other people, is now America alone, so to speak. They're going, fuck them. We can look after ourselves.
it's basically America only at this stage. I think for me, I would say that the US is one step below Russia in terms of a danger to it, simply because Russia has proven itself willing to use military force in order to achieve certain geopolitical objectives in Europe, whereas the US hasn't sunken that low yet.
Yeah.
But I would say that otherwise, they basically are on the same level as Russia when it comes to threat. Because you mentioned interference in European elections, the American government is just straight up doing that. Like Elon Musk endorsing every single far right political party that exists across the European continent, whether it's the AFD, the National Rally, Reform UK, etc. Well, hard right and far right parties together. He's endorsing every single one of them, and he's putting his money where his mouth is, and giving those parties straight up financial donations in order to give them extra resources to win elections. That, to me, is on the same level as when Russia not only does that, but also floods European internets with a load of pro right wing nonsense and pro Russia, anti NATO nonsense. So it is at that point where it's one step below the hybrid warfare that Russia does, but it's above the usual interference that most countries will do in elections.
I mean, it's a far cry from, say, you know, when Obama came over and said we'd be at the back of the queue with Brexit, or when some Labour members or campaigners went to go help the Kamala Harris campaign. There's that level of stuff, and then there's, you know, literally, Elon, who's right, you know, right there next to Trump at the head of the U.S. government. I'm going to interview the leader of the AfD on X and talk about what a really great moderate person you are. And by the way, let's do a little bit of historical revisionism about Adolf Hitler while we're at it as well. You know.
Yeah, and the thing about it is it's not even just European countries who are being threatened by this as well. It's also happening to Asian countries as well. South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan have all been a target of America's wrath recently, where Japan had tariffs placed on steel and rice, but for basically no reason, despite the fact that the Japanese Prime Minister went over to Trump and said, we're going to do $1 trillion in investment over the next 10 years. Didn't matter, got slapped with tariffs regardless. South Korea's been treated even worse than that. Oh, another thing that also happened with Japan as well is that they said to them, put more money into defense, even though they can't, because of financial issues and economic issues that they have. And there was also a thing that they were going to do where they were going to increase coordination between the Japanese military and US forces. Japan, that's potentially being scrapped now by the Trump administration. So they're being targeted for wrath. For South Korea, it's even worse. Not only have they had that happen with them with tariffs and also increased military defense, but they've been put on a list of countries which are basically sort of currency manipulators, or seen as basically the US's version of unfriendly countries, where they're called a sensitive country now, and have travel advice put against them. And with Taiwan, you had some American guy who was being nominated by the Defense Department who said you need to put 15% of your GDP into military defense. And it's like, what? Um, so the Asian countries are now being targeted by Trump's wrath. So the whole nonsense about, well, we're pivoting away from Europe to Asia is just that. It's nonsense. If that was the case, why are the Asian allies of America being targeted with the same equal level of hostility as what Europe is being faced with?
I mean, I've spent the last few months poring over trying to figure out exactly what the Trump agenda truly is, and you know, you get these explanations, like you sort of said, the idea of, well, they're abandoning Europe so they can pivot over to focus on China as one potential explanation for all that's going on. On another, there's the idea that Trump wants to turn the United States into an incredibly close ally of Russia. I think partly some people have said to try and peel them away from China, but then there's a lot of people who also think that's for the birds, really. Like, you know, the Russians and the Chinese are sensible enough in their own minds to go, no, you know, just because Donald Trump is dangling some jangly keys in front of us, we're not suddenly going to abandon our own foreign policy and alliances of the last few decades either.
Well, the other thing as well is that why on earth would China and Russia ally themselves with a country which has proven to be so unreliable that it's betraying allies it's had alliances with for 80 years?
Yeah, you go, wow, if this is how you treat your so-called friends. But by the way, I think there are two things I want to touch on here that we've not spoken about yet. One of them's Canada and Greenland. I'll do that one in just a moment. But the other one is the Ukraine war negotiations. That, you know, there was an awful lot going on. It felt like day by day we were having these new great big revelations, and it all felt on a bit of a knife edge what was going to happen. And then Zelensky, you know, says I'm up for a ceasefire, and he says he's going to sign the mineral deal, and basically, for all intents and purposes, appears to capitulate to most of whatever Trump's whims were. And then they go, right, okay, we've got this proposal for a ceasefire. Let's throw it over to the Russians and see what happens. Vladimir Putin says, "Niet," and then it's all gone a little bit quiet. And it's kind of just what's going on with that now. Clearly, there doesn't appear to be. I mean, it sounds really obvious me just even saying it out loud, but there doesn't appear to be the same kind of pressure being applied on the Russians from the USA than there was to the Ukrainians only a few weeks ago. That doesn't seem to be manifesting at all, as far as I can see. Unless you've seen or heard of anything I haven't, I don't think the Americans have been leaning on the Russians particularly. And he's muted, which is a terrible, terrible time for me to be left alone here. Let me read a few comments real quick. Object says, Cameron asked Obama to say you'll be at the back of the queue for a trade deal. Talking of which, Labour could help the economy grow by signing one with Trump ASAP. Shockwave adds, it is dangerous to be an enemy of America, but to be an ally is fatal. Henry Kissinger, I think that was, because I've seen that quote like underneath a hell of a lot of YouTube videos that I've been watching in the past few weeks and months as well. So until Tom returns, you know, I made my point about the state of the Ukraine, Russia, America negotiations. Canada and Greenland's a really interesting one, because ever since Trump started talking about that stuff, the counterpoint view was to say, yeah, well, you know, Trump comes out with all kinds of wild things. Often he's setting out a very extreme position of sorts, a sort of negotiating tactic that he says fire and fury of one particular thing, and then actually it's used as a means to get slightly more favorable conditions towards whatever his true objective turns out to be. I'm, as of yet, struggling somewhat to see what exactly his objectives are in regards to Canada and Greenland. Certainly in the case of Greenland, I think that, you know, maybe the States might have wanted a few extra, more of a military presence there than they've already got. Maybe they want access to some of their mineral wealth or other things that they could extract or something like that. But at least from what I'm hearing of so far, it doesn't seem like anything that the Denmark or Greenland or whoever have offered to the United States, which I'd assume they would be willing to make some efforts towards those kind of areas. It doesn't seem to have dissuaded Trump from his continued rhetoric of saying, yep, Greenland, we're going to have that one way or another, we'll have it. Or indeed all this 51st state Canada stuff. Now, you know, don't get me wrong, it seems very unfeasible to me, the idea of, like, you know, the US Army crossing the border over into Canada to try and take it in the same way you had like Russia invading Ukraine or something. However, the Canadians are taking it very seriously. The Canadians are taking it very seriously. And, you know, they've got a bit of a rally around the flag effect at the moment. So maybe you could arguably say, okay, well, you know, it pays very well for, if you're a politician of any color over in Canada right now, to be seen as standing up to the menace Donald Trump across the border. But nonetheless, you know, the fact that you've got these continued tariff wars going on right now with Canada, and the fact that he's still continuing on this 51st state rhetoric, and all that he said about Greenland as well, I'm not sitting here trying to say, oh yes, you know, I think that there's threat of an imminent invasion in a week or a month or whenever. Because for one thing, I'd probably look quite foolish if it didn't happen. But I can't, in my own mind, discount the possibility of something quite serious going on with those countries that seem to be in the United States crosshairs at the moment. I can't wholly just dismiss it in my own mind as going, oh, it's just Trump being Trump, you know? Oh, this is all about him trying to get an even better trade deal with one of those countries or something like that. There's something about this that feels as if it all does go very badly and very wrong, and the worst kinds of things do happen, then at some point in the future, everyone will be saying, Christ, well, it's not as if he didn't warn us. He kept saying it over and over and over and over and over again. And the countries in question were very concerned and saying, we're very concerned about this. And then everyone else just went, oh, but we just didn't know. We just didn't know whether to take Trump literally or seriously, which one it was supposed to be. But yeah, unfortunately, I'm kind of talking to myself here because Tom seems to have disappeared off. But you dear viewers have heard that. I was hoping to get Tom's thoughts on Well, mate, I'll ask you guys. I'll ask you guys in the chat. What what do you make of this stuff at the moment? With Canada and or Greenland for that matter. I'll take a few of your comments here in the chat. Shockwave says Canada 51st state already makes Trump's territorial ambitions proportionately more extreme than Putin. The whole country versus part of the country. And Objective 8 says it will be interesting to see what happens in the general election in 6 weeks in Canada. Yeah, well, from what I understand, the Liberal Party in Canada has had quite a resurgence. It kind of seemed fairly nailed on that the Conservatives over there were going to end up winning. And I think I've forgotten his name, but I think the leader of the Conservatives over there was sort of like a bit of a populist right-winger himself, as many people are these days on the right of politics, representing a major party. And yet, Donald Trump and the way that he's acted towards Canada seems to have turned people slightly off of him and more towards the Liberals again. Probably in no small part down to the fact that Justin Trudeau is gone, and Mark Carney seems to be enjoying a sort of a quite a honeymoon period right now. Oh, Object. I will just warn you, by the way, Ogum the Bold is a bot of sorts. I've never quite been able to pin down what inputs creates Ogum the Bold's outputs. But don't bother trying to debate with Ogum the Bold in the chat here. You won't get anywhere, I'm afraid. Yeah. So I've said my piece on that one for the time being. In the absence of Tom being back, I don't know where he's gone. What I do want to do is we'll take a quick little look at the opinion polls in the country as well. Object says, "All right, thanks," and Ogum then replies, "A bot that stood for the Green Party." Yeah, so let's take a little look at the polling here. So this is our lovely Wikipedia national poll of polls. What's been happening lately? Well, it would appear that for the time being, Reform has peaked. They peaked a couple of weeks ago, and they've been on a bit of a downward slide since then. Do you want to attribute some of this to Ukraine being a prominent issue and Farage being sort of against the grain of public opinion in sort of attitudes towards Putin, Trump, Russia, all that kind of stuff? Do you perhaps want to try and tie in the internal divisions within Reform regarding Rupert Lowe into the mix as well? As we've said on this channel before, most people out there in the country won't have even heard of Rupert Lowe and probably don't have particularly strong opinions about him. But I suppose if you're either a Reform member who does follow this stuff more closely and is against everything that's happening right now, or indeed just if you're kind of just casually gazing at it and going, "Oh, well, it looks like they're divided. They're not they're not a united front like they're supposed to be." That could be a bit damaging for them as well. But where's everyone else at? Well, Labour's kind of been holding steady, I guess you could say, for the last month or so. The Tories arguably the same, maybe ever so slightly up, but not a great deal there. I think the only real movement that's clear enough that's worth commenting on really of the past month or so is that Reform seems to have dropped a few points from their peak, and the Lib Dems seem to be on the up as well. The Lib Dems, I imagine, obviously being able to benefit from the fact that being a relatively small party in opposition, they can, say whatever. Ed Davey can come out and say whatever he wants about Donald Trump, and there won't be any consequences. So then everyone gets to go, "Oh yeah, Ed Davey, look at him, yeah, giving it to Donald Trump. Well done, you, Ed Davey." And obviously, as well, the Lib Dems sort of positioning themselves now to the left of Labour on certain issues as well. And God knows Labour's moving themselves to the right in some areas. That's enabling them, I think, to gain some support as well. So, yeah, broad strokes here as far as the national opinion. But I mean, the Greens are up a little bit as well. But broad strokes, I'd say Reform down, Lib Dems up, everyone else maybe just about level with where they had been before. Object says no. No, this is down to the Rupert Lowe split. Well, the thing is though, I think that their drop preceded the Rupert Lowe thing. So I wouldn't say that it's all. I'd say potentially some of it's down to the Rupert Lowe thing, but I wouldn't necessarily say that it's all down to it, because I think that they started dropping off prior to this becoming an issue. Also, Farage not wanting remigration. Ah, yes, that old chestnut, or mass deportations, as we used to call it. Apollo here also says, hi, sorry, missed, only woke up 10 minutes ago from a nap. No worries, Apollo. I believe there is a coalition of the willing meeting in Paris on Thursday that Starmer is going to attend. Starmer hoping his foreign issues help with the polls. Well, I think Starmer on the world stage, and Starmer, the European security organizer, seems to be the best face that Starmer's been able to put on since he became prime minister. I think of all the, or most of the things that he and his government have done since they came to power, that sort of his approach towards European security in Ukraine seems to be the one that's won the most applause from the public at large, and indeed sort of across political divides as well. So yeah, it might help him. It might help him a little bit if he's seen to be in charge of this kind of stuff abroad. But of course, you still need to have your house in order at home as well. Object says it does seem to have kicked off 15 days ago for the Lowe business. Yeah, but the polls wouldn't have been affected that quickly. It's true. Yeah, I mean, what I'd say, Object, is I think it's perfectly feasible that this Lowe business has damaged reform and may have accelerated the rate that they're decreasing in the polls at the moment. But I do think they were beginning to slide before that became an issue also. Tom, welcome back.
Welcome back. But yeah, I've heard about the Lowe situation. I think
sorry. Just before you jump in on Lowe, I just want to backpedal just a little bit. You were away when I was talking about Canada and Greenland, and I just wanted to get your 2 cents on basically what you think's going on there and how seriously you feel that we should be concerned.
For those two issues, I think that the Greenland situation is much more concerning than the Canada situation, but both are equally concerning. With Greenland, the US already has a military presence there, and it really wouldn't take much for them to actually take over the island, because their military presence in Greenland vastly outnumbers the entire Danish military. And the thing that I could very well see happening in Greenland, if Trump really wanted to go that far, is I could see to him doing to Greenland what Russia did to Crimea. Because one of the reasons why Russia took over Crimea so quickly in 2014 was because they had a naval base with a large military presence in the city of Sevastopol, located in Crimea. And so when Putin gave the go-ahead to take over Crimea, all the Russian military had to do was walk out of their naval base in Crimea and then could quickly take over all the cities from Sevastopol, because Sevastopol connects to all of Crimea, and they seized control of it and basically just pushed all of the Ukrainian army out of Crimea. And if Trump wanted to do so, I could very well see him doing to Greenland what Russia did to Crimea, and there would be very little that could be done to actually stop him.
The point I'd made on this when you were away was that often what's said about Trump is that he makes these outrageous claims of what he wants, but actually it's part of a negotiating position, and it's say the most outrageous thing and then everyone will get flustered and offer him the world on a stick as a result. But what I'm seeing as far as Greenland's concerned at the moment is that I feel as if it was the US wanting more of a military presence there, or if it was they wanted access to minerals or other natural resources there or whatever, I feel as if behind closed doors, probably Denmark and Greenland would have already been offering him these things. And it's obviously notable to me that he's not stopped the rhetoric of saying, I want Greenland one way or another, which does make me think maybe that this is a more serious thing than just, oh, he's making some outlandish proposal and hoping for, something.
Yeah, it goes beyond that. It's not really a case of negotiation tactics because he's rejected mineral and cooperation agreements from Greenland and Denmark. Is also an ideological motivation behind this as well. A lot of people within the Trump administration subscribe to a philosophy called paleoconservatism. Now, there's a whole bunch that goes into that, but the main thing about it that's related to Greenland is paleoconservatives in the US believe in something called hemispheric dominance, which basically is the belief that the US has a sphere of influence that extends across the Americas.
So it's very much the equivalent of like Russia with their whole backyard of former Soviet countries, basically. Then it's kind of going, we are the biggest power in our neck of the woods in our part of the world, therefore we should do whatever the fuck we want in the surrounding
basically that's the way it works. Essentially, they believe that the US has all of the Americas, both North and South, included within its sphere of influence, and it has the right to have complete, unquestioned dominance within that particular area. And Greenland is located within the North American continent, so Greenland falls over that sphere of influence that they outline. And so they want it simply because it's in North America and it's part of their ideology that furthers with hemispheric dominance. So with Greenland, I do think there is a very strong chance he'll take it if he wants to. But whether he follows through on it or not, I'm not entirely sure. But it is known that they are doing war plans amongst certain American military units over there about a potential takeover of the island. And another thing that's also been going on recently is US officials have been going to Greenland repeatedly in order to basically provoke a confrontation of some sorts. The most recent example of this is JD Vance's wife, Usha Vance, I believe her name is, recently went to Greenland herself. So these trips are basically increasing because what they're really hoping for is some kind of a confrontation between the US officials and locals so they can use that as a justification for some kind of action.
JD Vance appears behind a podium. My wife went to Greenland and someone threw eggs at her, so we're going to annex Greenland as a result.
Yeah, as for Canada, that's more or less the same as the Greenland situation. But I think that what Trump will do is rather than use military means to take Canada, I think he'll use other means in order to try and take them over. I think he will use mainly economic coercion in order to do it, where basically he wants to cripple the Canadian economy to the point of ruin. And then once the Canadian economy has been basically crippled and destroyed and plunged into a deep depression, he basically presents the Canadians with the choice of we can end this and restore your prosperity to what it was before these trade wars happened, but the condition of that is you must join the US as a union, a personal union, basically, or a state union. And the other thing that's also particularly concerning about it is a lot of people in the US who are of the more liberal leaning have said, well, if you take over Canada and make them the 51st state, then the Democrats will win every congressional election from here until now. And the MAGA Republicans have said, who said about making the Canada a state? We're going to make them a territory like Puerto Rico. We're not going to make them a state because we're not going to give them voting rights.
I mean, I'm tempted to wade in and go, but hang on a minute, isn't this whole shtick about them being the 51st state? But then I realise I'm entering into a conversation on the territory of actually debating what the rightful place of Canada within the United States would be, and it's like, no, I'm not playing that game. That's not on the agenda here. We shouldn't be entertaining that kind of debate because there should be no question of no, the United States is not going to be allowed to take Canada.
When they mention that about the 51st state thing, they say that that's just for PR purposes. The reason why they're saying that is because they want to make it easier for the international community and for Canada to accept being taken over. Because if they came out and said we want Canada to be however many territories we've got, number next territory, then everybody would turn against us because they'd see us as sneering imperialists. Whereas with the 51st state thing, it gives them a PR cover where they can go, oh, see, we're not being that terrible. We're going to give them voter rights. But when they take them over, we're not going to give them voter rights because we're going to make them a territory.
Oh. I
essentially,
really laughed there at the idea of them, you know, the idea of them not wanting to be seen as sneering imperialists.
essentially, what they basically want is, in accordance with their basically one and only ally at this stage, they want to create a
Hang on,
situation.
who's their one and only ally? Is it Russia or Israel?
Well, I'll tell you in a minute, because
okay.
it'll be quite obvious in a minute.
All right.
In accordance with what their one and only ally, they want to create a situation on the ground in Canada that is similar to what Israel does in the West Bank. That's sort of their blueprint. What Israel does in the West Bank is what they want to do to Canada, where they take over this territory and they slowly integrate it into their country, but they give the people there basically no rights.
Oh. Well, I appreciate your take on that anyway, Tom, because I had wanted to hear what your thoughts about all of that were, and I didn't get the chance earlier when I was just sort of monologuing on it. So the answer in short is yes, we should be concerned. It doesn't necessarily mean anything. It doesn't necessarily mean anything's going to happen imminently, and it is indeed possible. Maybe nothing happens, but it's not. That's not guaranteed. There clearly is attention being paid to these countries with certain kinds of ambitions, and it just remains to be seen how far this ends up going, really.
For me, I would say that the danger times periods to watch out for are 2026 and 2028 and the period in between. The reason for that is basically that's when the midterms will be, and that's when the next presidential election will be. If Trump feels that he's being pushed too far into a corner, then it's possible that he could take military action like this as he sees it as an opportunity to potentially boost his approval ratings, or at least get the MAGA movement fired up against his enemies. So I don't think anything's going to happen this year with Greenland or Canada, but I think that this year will be setting the stage for potential action that could happen from 2026 onwards. So those are the two dates to really watch out for: 2026 and 2028, and the period in between.
Okay, thank you. Just going back onto the reform stuff, Apollo had said in the chat, I think the low stuff making the news will have reduced reform popularity amongst normies rather than the poll dip being amongst the pro-remigration lot on Twitter, because there are more reform normies turned off by internal reform fights than there are remigration reform people annoyed at Farage. I just wanted to add that there to the conversation. And I took a little look at the polls while you were away as well, Tom. And in the past month or so, we've had a dip in support for reform. The Lib Dems have been up a bit. Labour and the Tories roughly where they were before. That's kind of where we're at. When are the locals? May
1st of May, I believe.
First, okay, so we're not that far off. Actually, we're about what 5 weeks? 5 weeks away from the locals and that by-election as well, for that matter.
Yeah, definitely, I'd say so. Those will be an interesting one to witness. I think that the biggest story of the locals will probably be the reform surge, because I think that Labour and Tory will do incredibly badly in the locals, especially the Tories, And I think that Reform, the Greens, and the Liberal Democrats will all do really well, with Reform winning hundreds of seats. I saw
Yeah,
Britain
yeah.
OX put out a pollcast as to what they think would happen with the locals, and they basically said that Reform would win about 400 seats.
Yeah, yeah. I think that. I mean, certainly what you said about who will be up and who will be down. I completely agree with that. As far as the number of seats goes, I don't know. I'll probably have a better guesstimate a little bit closer to the time. But certainly, I do see Reform winning hundreds of seats for sure. I want to take. We've got Alfie Penfold here in the chat who says, realistically, Trump would have to leave NATO first before mounting incursions into Greenland or Denmark. I expect that may well happen if Russia-Ukraine can be resolved. Starmer's coalition of the willing, absence of the US, plays right into Trump's hands in this regard. On that second point, Alfie, part of the whole coalition of the willing thing, though, the thing that time and time again Starmer and the others have been saying is that they want a US backstop for this. They've sort of been stepping up to the plate. And in part, that was kind of seen as them trying to show willingness to the United States, I think, of going, hey, look, Europe's on the ball. We're going to get involved. We're not just relying on it being you. We want to play a part in this as well. We just don't want you to fully walk away from the stage here. Now, how likely of success that is, you can have your own thoughts, but that's what I saw as being their motivation in that. But all the while they had been saying, but we want the US to back us up in this. So I don't know how much I think about that playing into Trump's hands per se, because I feel as if it was an effort to try and make overtures towards Trump to say, look, we're getting involved, but we still need you. But I mean, ultimately, I mean, like when we saw those internal messages earlier on, the way that the top of the Trump administration, their regards towards Europe is really not good for us. Trump's team have been repeatedly dismissive of the COW. What does COW stand for, Tom?
I honestly
COW.
don't know. I've not actually heard of it, to be fair.
Okay. Alfie, feel free to elaborate for us there. Coalition of Willing. Coalition of the Willing.
Coalition of Willing.
That's the
Okay.
cow. There we are. The last thing Trump wants is more US spending / presence in Europe. But the thing is, realistically, the coalition of the willing cannot step in to fill the void of the United States. Even with the best will in the world right now, it's going to take us a good few years to get ourselves to the point where we have enough military muscle to really be able to fill that void. It's not as if we could just go, flick our fingers and go, oh, right then, okay, well, we've all stepped up now, so the US is no longer needed. It's almost a more desperate kind of play to say, look, we will step up, but actually we do need you because we can't do it ourselves at the moment.
Well, this goes back to what I said before at the very start of this, where the Europeans seem to just be in complete denial about what the US thinks of them and what the US's current role is. Where they seem to think that they can still somehow bring them on side through appeasing them, and it's just not going to work because they fundamentally see Europe as an ideological enemy of theirs that has to be combated because they are a threat to their project that they want to see implemented, not only in the United States, but also across the rest of the Western world.
This is the view that I'm beginning to come round to. I was much more open to the idea a couple of months ago of it was all part of this kind of ploy for Trump to say, try and stick a rocket underneath the Europeans, get them to commit to their NATO spending that they weren't really doing, all that sort of thing. Again, the whole negotiating tactic shtick, the idea of saying something outrageous and it gets people to do what you want. But I am increasingly beginning to consider exactly the way that you've just put it, Tom, which is that we are indeed entering a much more serious division of alliances and ideology than just America trying to throw its weight around and get us to put more effort in on our part. Right, I'll read one more comment here, and then I want to jump back to something that was said a little bit earlier. DMA is absolutely. Oh, that's you. DMA is absolutely right. The US has a plan and is sticking to it. Europe only desperately skirting around the edges. Leaked WhatsApp messages yesterday confirmed absolute US disdain for Europe. Well, on that much, Alfie. Yes, I think you're quite right. We looked at. We discussed those messages a little bit earlier in this stream. And indeed, constant bailing Europe out, pathetic, and tell us what you really think. Question here from Apollo TD says, will Labour still go up due to the 2021 low point? This is in the local elections, obviously 2021. It was the Boris Johnson bounce. He just rolled out the vaccine. It was the height of the Tory popularity, I think. And indeed, I think round about that time, they'd even won the Hartlepool by-election, which was quite a coup for the Tories there. So relative to that being the situation, will Labour still go up versus the 2021 low point? I'm tempted to say yes, I think they will, but I think it will be quite anemic. I think that versus just how strong the Tories were in 2021, relative to that, yes, Labour probably are doing better. But given Labour's deep unpopularity at present also, I think the real winners of the locals will be the smaller parties, i.e. Reform, Greens, Liberal Democrats. We've got a further comment from Apollo TD here, back on America. We're really jumping from topic to topic here. The worry is not only the GOP is backing Trump's foreign policy, but parts of the Democratic Party's isolationist wing are too. Dems barely calling out Trump on foreign policy after their main on foreign policy. Their main issue is Doge. Doge. Yes, that's it. I used to pronounce it as Dodge for years and years, wrongly. And it's still a thing I'm trying to stop myself from doing sometimes. Yeah. I mean, obviously, the Democrats, I think, largely are more attuned to the. It's quite scary saying it this way. The old view America used to have, the previous view America used to have in regards to Europe and the NATO alliance and all the rest of it. But yeah, first and foremost, their concerns are domestic as well, and that is what they're going to be focusing on. And actually, I think the Democrats are pretty. They're being a bit wet at the moment. I don't see or hear them really doing much. I mean, of course,
It's because they're basically.
Well, I was going to say they don't have control of either of the houses or anything like that, so it's limited what they can do realistically to combat Trump right now. But they nonetheless they still seem to be quite quiet. I don't feel as if I'm hearing much from them compared to say the first Trump term.
That's because they're completely demoralized. The reason for it is because they basically thought that when they won in 2020, that was the Trump phenomenon and the MAGA movement completely and comprehensively defeated. They thought that they had won so decisively that was the end of Trump's political career and that they could go back to business as usual. Not only did Trump win, show that to be completely false, but the amount that he won by in terms of electoral votes and him winning the popular vote completely shattered their entire worldview. Because you have to remember, when Biden was first elected, he said that his main reason for being there was to end the Trump era. Basically, to make sure that the Trump era was a part of America's past that would ultimately never be repeated. That was what Biden was elected to do, and he completely failed in achieving that because, well, Trump's back and he's stronger than ever. So that was the issue as well. The other thing with it from the electoral point of view is that the Democrats were so incredibly and completely defeated that it was just a massive shock to them completely. Because when the election was still going on, everyone had the view that it was going to be close and that it would go on for days, if not weeks, the vote count. It ended within the very same day that the voting began. And not only did Trump win, but he won all 7 swing states. And on top of that, he also won the popular vote. And the other thing that I think demoralizes the Democrats more than anything else is that the voter coalition that Trump created was the most diverse voter coalition that the Republican Party has ever had in its history, not only in terms of social background or in terms of political views, but also explicitly in terms of ethnic background. A very large amount of ethnic minorities in the US, from Latinos to Asians, voted for Trump in his and the Republican Party in historic numbers. And you have to keep in mind that the Democratic Party worldview was that as America became a more diverse country, their political power would increase. And eventually, it would get to a point where America was so diverse that the Democratic Party's hold over American politics would be hegemonic because they had the belief that minorities are more likely to vote for the Democrats than vote for the Republicans. That worldview has now been completely and utterly shattered because of the fact that the minority vote for the Republicans and Trump went up massively and it went down massively for the Democrats, whereas the white vote went up for the Democrats and down for the Republicans.
I mean,
So
that's
their entire basis of politics, their entire worldview has been completely shattered, and they don't know what to do with themselves now anymore. They don't know where they go from here now.
I mean that set of assumptions appeared true at the time of, say, Obama, you know, a decade and a half ago or so. But certainly, yeah, things have shifted since then. Um, yeah, I broadly agree with what you've had to say there on the Democrats.
So basically, I'm of the opinion that up until the midterms, we won't see or hear much of anything from the Democrats. They're basically going to stake everything that they have on the midterms and hope that they can win the House.
I mean,
And up until the
their biggest hope at the moment, I'm assuming, is that Trump fucks up the US economy so badly that enough voters go, oh my God, I voted for Donald Trump because I thought he'd be good for the economy and I didn't like the inflation under Biden. And well, you look at this, I'm worse off than I was 2 years ago. That's the hope, I'm assuming, right? That's the cavalry that we're
yeah.
hoping will charge in and save them right now.
Yeah, it basically is that is their only hope that they have, which is why you just won't see or hear much of anything from them until the aftermath of the midterms. The other thing as well is they may be doing it more pragmatically as well, because the Democratic Party in the US right now is at historic levels of unpopularity. Only 29% of Americans have a favorable view of the Democratic Party right now, which is the lowest on record for the party.
I mean,
So
I don't have a favourable view of the Democratic Party, and I'm desperate for them to get back in power. And even I don't have
yeah,
a favourable view of them, you know.
yeah, and that's the sort of and so the assumption may be from the upper echelons of the party of we're deeply unpopular. Nobody wants to see us right now, so we'll keep our heads down and wait and let Trump hopefully sink his popularity, and we can capitalize on that in 2026 onwards.
Gotcha. Right, Tom. I think I'm going to look to wrap up for today. We've had a decent length stream, catching up with you guys. First time in about a week and a half. Are there any final things that you wish to add on anything that we've discussed so far, or for that matter, anything that we haven't?
No, I believe we covered everything we wanted to cover. There's nothing else in particular that I can think of at the moment.
Jolly good. Well, what I'll say then, by the way, if any of the dear viewers are looking for recommendations or things to watch online, I've recently got into the Rest is History podcast. Tom Holland and Dominic Sandbrook, I want to say. I'd occasionally seen The Rest is Politics, but there's only so much, centrism you can stomach for one sitting at a time. But I think it was Dominic Sandbrook had appeared on the Rest is Politics' panel for the US election, and of the panel of 5 that they had, he was the only one who predicted a Trump victory. And the rest of them all thought it would be Kamala Harris. And that was noteworthy to me at the very least, because he was there as a historian, whereas the rest of them were all sort of contemporary political commentators. So I thought that was interesting. And I've been binge watching their stuff for sort of the past week or so. And I think it's absolutely fascinating. I think it's a really good marker of like really well presented informational and entertaining content, is that you can hear about a topic that you never would have been interested in before, or never would have even thought that you'd want to sit and listen to hours and hours of discussion about. And yet, because of the way that it's presented, it seems just that incredibly interesting. So just in the past week or so, I've been listening to The Rest is History. They've been looking at I've been listening to them talk about the life of General Custer in the United States, the Battle of Little Bighorn, Custer's Last Stand, Crazy Horse, all that sort of stuff. The Belgian colony that they had in the Congo, the Heart of Darkness, that kind of thing. And then recently I'm looking at I've been looking at stuff they've been talking about, sort of medieval kings, the transition from the Roman Empire into the, not modern, but into the medieval era. That just the last day I've been looking at them talking about Charlemagne and stuff like that. And honestly, all of this stuff is, I'm interested enough in history, but some of these really specific things that I've never given much consideration to. And it's really testament to the quality of the discussions they're having and the way that they lay out the historical narratives that I just think is so compelling for me at the moment. So I just want to share that with you guys, that if none of you have checked out The Rest is History before, I'd recommend doing so. I think it's a really, really good podcast. Couple comments here as well. Apollo TD says Rest is History is good, especially the World War II lead up stuff. Frank says great stream, Swiss and Tom. Thanks for a great recap. I've been tuned out of the news a little bit the last couple of weeks due to some personal health issues, so this was good for me. Well, I'm really pleased to hear that, Frank. And I wish you well with whatever you've got going on at the moment. But at the very least, I'm pleased that you've enjoyed our stream today. And thank you also to Objective Hate there as well. All right then, Tom, I will go. As will you. Thank you very much for joining me today. And I always appreciate, by the way, that I can get in touch with you at basically very short notice, and more often than not, you're able to come on stream. It's always a very big help for me and my hosting duties here. So thank you very much for that.
You're welcome.
Right, awesome. In which case, guys, thank you for joining us. Please do drop the stream a like if you haven't already. Obviously, yes, we've got Spring Statement coming soon. I may or may not be able to react to that immediately, but I'll probably be here on the channel to talk about some of it but by the end of the week at the very least, something like that. All right then, cheers guys, thank you. Ta-ta.
Goodbye.